Hi. Since video 3, I've been working on analyzing those MRI images. Um, and I don't have any real updates to show yet. Sometimes science just takes a while and it even can get a little monotonous just tracing and tracing those image segments. But I'll let you know what's happening with that soon. I'm also heading out to the field station, the University of Queensland Moreton Bay field station soon, so that I can collect some more animals. Depending on what we find, I'll be able to try physiology, behavior experiments, as well as hopefully getting specimens for some more advanced imaging. But before I head to the field, I want to tell you a story. This story is both amazing and mysterious. It's the story of cephalopod evolution. The beginnings of this story are a bit fuzzy. It started around 600 to 800 million years ago with the very first animal life on Earth. Now, we don't know very much about those early animals because they were probably very small and soft, and small, soft things don't fossilize well. Up until that time, for several billion years, most of the life on Earth had been single-celled things, like bacteria and algae. Check out this timeline. You can see that for like 3 billion years of dark green is all single-celled life. Now, there were a few organisms that formed simple colonies, like cells joined together in sheets or long chains. But all the cells within that organism tended to be identical and serve the same functions. Animals were the first organisms to have different kinds of cells in a multicellular life form that were specialized to do different jobs. Plants eventually did the same thing on their own, but they did it later on. Before long, this animal revolution took off. About 542 million years ago, there was a thing called the Cambrian explosion. Now, this wasn't a physical explosion like a volcano or an asteroid. It was an evolutionary explosion. The animals were doing so well with this whole specialized tissue thing that mutations were often successful and led to new body types and new functions emerging. In fact, it was sort of an arms race. Animals would eat other animals. So if an animal was born with a mutation that made it bigger or faster, that gave it armor or defenses, that made it better able to sense the environment around it, that was a winning mutation, and new species would emerge. Last time you and I shared a common ancestor with a cephalopod was probably sometime before the Cambrian explosion. We don't have an exact date or fossil of what that common ancestor was, but scientists speculate it was a fairly simple little worm-like thing with a primitive light-sensing eye that they call bilaterian. It could have been crawling around the bottom of the ocean 500 or 600 million years ago. That's a long time that we've been evolving separately. The whole time that animals have existed, nearly. That brings us to one of the cool reasons to study cephalopods. Our last common ancestor had a pretty tiny and primitive nervous system. Since then, we evolved big brains that do interesting things. And so did they, but totally separately. Doesn't that make you really curious to know what's the same and what's different? I think it's just fascinating. But let's turn the clock forward a little. The first fossil we have that's definitively a cephalopod is from about 530 million years ago, which was during the early Cambrian. It's called a plectronocera. Cephalopods are mollusks, like snails and clams. So that first cephalopod probably looked a bit like a snail with a conical, like party hat shaped shell on top. What distinguishes them from snails is that they have a modification to their shell. It contains air chambers trapped inside that act as a buoyancy device. That lets cephalopods hover in the ocean column. Nautiluses, which are the only living species of cephalopod that still has an external shell, they still have these buoyancy chambers inside their shell that lets them hover in the water. So that was a feature of the very early cephalopods. They also seems like they probably had, these early cephalopods probably had a muscular tube called a funnel, which again, all the modern lineages of cephalopods still have. That funnel allows them to squirt water and propel themselves along. Now these guys, this Plectronocera, were little. The fossils that we have are only a few millimeters across. So those first cephalopods were definitely on the small side. By about 400 million years ago, during the Paleozoic, cephalopods began to diversify. You can find fossil shells with lots of different shapes. Those straight party hat shaped shells, as well as coiled shells, all kinds of crazy shaped shells. Also a huge range of sizes at this point. They also appear to have evolved beaks by this Paleozoic time point, and those beaks probably let them get bigger and eat bigger things. Over time, some cephalopods evolved smaller shells relative to their body size. So this was a give and take. A smaller shell meant less protection for their soft bodies from predators, but it gave them the advantage of being able to get more muscular, expanding that muscular funnel to move faster, or some of them developed lateral fins that could help them maybe navigate their position through the water better. Finally, about 350 million years ago, one lineage of cephalopods developed an internal shell. The body grew around the shell, allowing a lot greater freedom of locomotion and new body shapes and types to form. But of course, this came at the cost of protection. The shell internalization seems to have happened just once, and all of the current coleoid cephalopods, that's all the squid, cuttlefish, octopuses, are all descendants from that one common ancestor. Without their shells, they could theoretically move faster and with much greater agility, and that helped them to catch prey and escape predators. But of course, the only way they could actually have greater speed and agility is if their nervous system changed too, to drive the muscles in the appropriate patterns. So suddenly, animals that could swim faster and better would eat the best and have more babies, and thus the brain would evolve to go with the loss of shell. Camouflage evolved too. Animals that could blend into the background would be more likely to live to reproduce without getting eaten. So the coleoid cephalopods had their own period of rapid evolution and adaptive radiation. New body types evolved, nervous systems expanded, and we ended up with the diverse and clever set of animals that we see today. But all the cephalopods didn't internalize their shell. Many other species lived on with their shells, like ammonites. Interestingly, all but the nautilids have now gone extinct. Many of the ammonites went extinct at the same time as the dinosaurs went extinct, about 66 million years ago. But for hundreds of million years, they were very successful in the ocean. And their brains seem to have stayed relatively small. No need for a big brain as long as you have a shell. But back to the coleoid cephalopods. Do they still have an internal shell? Yes and no. There is one living species that still has an internal shell. It's called the ram's horn squid. They live in very deep water, so they very rarely are seen. They do seem to use their shell for buoyancy, like a nautilus. The first time scientists saw a living one in the ocean was with the camera on a deep submersible off the coast of Australia in 2020. And one of the crazy things they learned when they saw it was that it swims with its mantle down and its arms up. Most cephalopods swim either with the arms down or the arms to the side. So this was a surprise, and it shows how little we know and how much we still have to learn about deep ocean animals. Although this animal is rarely seen, their shells do wash up on beaches sometimes, so keep an eye out. Cuttlefish also still have an internal shell, the cuttlebone. You might see these in pet stores, actually. They're used in bird cages and with reptiles to get their calcium. It's located here under the mantle skin on their back. It's a calcified structure that has air trapped inside to help provide buoyancy. You can see how the bone is full of tiny air spaces here, but it also limits their depth. If a cuttlefish goes too deep, the bone would actually implode from the pressure of the deep ocean. That's why there are no cuttlefish in the Americas. They evolved on this side of the world after the continents had separated, and they can't cross the deep ocean to reach the Americas. Squid have a structure called a gladius, which is the remnant of their internal shell. It is no longer calcified or mineralized. Instead, it's made of chitin and protein. And it has no air spaces in it, so it's not used for buoyancy. Instead, it gives the body some structure, and it's an attachment point for some of their muscles. It looks kind of like an old-fashioned quill, and so it's also sometimes called the pen, which is a fitting name for a structure in an animal that has its own supply of ink. Octopuses have lost their shell entirely, giving them the ability to squeeze into tight spaces. The only remaining hard structure in an octopus's body is its beak. Well, I hope you've enjoyed learning about cephalopod evolution and the wild and wonderful forms these animals take and how they might have gotten there. I will put my sources in the credits, and then I'll also stick a few links down in the video description below if you want to learn more. Thanks. See you next time.